the good old summertime, in the good old summertime.
Welcome to part 2 of this episode of the Golden Age of Cricket podcast, dedicated to the later part of the life and career of former Australian captain Billy Murdoch. My name is Tom Ford. We return now as I'm joined by Murdoch's biographers Richard Cashman and Ric Sissons. So after his first season with Sussex in 1893, he returns to Australia with Jemima in the Australian summer, 93-94, for the first time since they've moved to England. Reading your book, we learn about his application to play for New South Wales in a Shield match against Victoria, which became controversial, didn't it? Why was this so controversial?
I think because he wasn't actually living in New South Wales. I think they came back to Australia. Every time they came back to Australia,
to sort out their finances.
To sort out the will and the finances.
Yes.
Watson had stipulated that Watson owned this vast amount of property. He'd invested in all manner of things, but he stipulated that none of this property could be sold until 20 years after his death. So that was all these legal issues, lots of court cases, and that was why they came back in 93, 94, and why they then came back prior to his death in 1909, 10, 11. They were based in Melbourne, and the issue arose. I think that is the question of why he wasn't in New South Wales anymore. He was born in Bendigo. Why should he be allowed to play in New South Wales? There were other precedents, like Jim Phillips, who was in England, the MCC, and later an umpire. He used to come back and play. So there were precedents of people coming back and playing. He was always very strongly pro New South Wales. He'd always said, even when they lived in Melbourne, that he would never play for Victoria. He always felt he was from New South Wales, and that's who he would play for. That was around 1889, after he started playing cricket again after Watson's death. He was never any question he was going to play for anybody but for New South Wales.
So we have touched on this already, but he's captaining Sussex in England. Sussex are a weak side at this point in time in the early 1890s, mid-1890s. Around the mid-1890s, their batting stocks are boosted by the arrival of Ranjit Singh and C.B. Fry, but their bowling continues to be a worry, and Murdoch recruits the 40-year-old Alfred Shaw, rather rotund Alfred Shaw, who history remembers as the first bowler of a ball in Test cricket. Why do you think he recruited such an ageing bowler? I mean, I think even after a few seasons, Shaw just can't bowl anymore because Murdoch's driving him into the ground, literally, and even Murdoch has to take up bowling. What do you think this says about Murdoch as a captain? Was he, in terms of the using his bowlers, was he a good captain on that front, do you think?
I think Murdoch recruiting Shaw was bizarre, and Shaw wanting to play is even more bizarre by this point. Shaw hasn't played for some time. He's employed by Lord Sheffield, who's then, of course, the president patron of Sussex, and Murdoch has to get permission of Lord Sheffield for Shaw to play for Sussex. So it wasn't a foregone conclusion he would play, and he barely played in the end. It was just too hard for him. I mean, he complains about the fact Murdoch bowled him for long periods and that he had sore feet, and in the end he just quit. It was just all too much for him, really. And it was an odd decision, really, but then maybe it was just a reflection of the poor state of, because Murdoch repeatedly says after Shaw bowls to him in the net, you've got to come and play for Sussex, you've got to come and play, because Shaw was involved in Sussex cricket through Lord Sheffield. And in the end, Shaw reluctantly agreed. It didn't last long. I think he only played one season and then only a small number of matches. But also because Murdoch bowled him for long periods. This old man bowling dozens and dozens of overs was ridiculous.
Do we have any indication? I assume there isn't any footage of, I don't think there's footage of Murdoch batting. Do we have any idea of what sort of bowler Murdoch was? His bowling records are small. I think he took something like 10 first-class wickets. But as I mentioned, he had to take up the bowling for Sussex because their stocks were so low. What do we know about his bowling?
As I understand it, was a sort of medium-pace round-arm bowler. There's certainly no photographs of him bowling. Nothing particular. I used to play in club cricket and open the bowling, get a few wickets and so forth, but not much of a bowler, frankly. That seems pretty clear.
Probably better as a wicketkeeper.
Yes, well, of course, he was a very good wicketkeeper early on, wasn't he?
Yeah.
So let's hurry along to, say, the late 1890s. He's still playing for Sussex, but 1899 in particular was his annus horribilis. His form slumped terribly. His mother died. You mentioned before that his mother moved with them to England. And of course, he continues to have all sorts of financial issues, and he gives up the Sussex captaincy as well. So he's 45 years old at this stage. What sort of man was he sort of internally? How did he cope during tough times? Was he a resilient individual?
Well, when his mother died in 1899, he just stopped playing cricket, period. His mother didn't live with them. She lived separately in Knightsbridge with a servant. And, this is a woman whose background was, daughter of a convict, had worked. She changed. Initially, she was Susanna Flegg, presented herself as a completely different person, I think, from what she was originally. And Murdoch was obviously very close to her. The fact that he wanted to be buried with her is, I think, very symptomatic of that. So that death of his mother in 1899 must have obviously rocked him, because he stopped playing cricket altogether halfway through the season. What does that show about him? Well, I suppose was he resilient, or given the circumstances of his mother? I think it shows he was a great character that he stopped playing cricket, actually, that this was more important to him than playing county cricket.
I think he was overall a pretty resilient person, particularly in his younger days. An optimistic person, had a good sense of humour. But perhaps the resiliency was tested as he got older and as he put on more weight, and he drank a lot as well. And so life got tougher for him.
So the following year, in 1900, he joins London County Cricket Club, which of course is also headed up by the great W.G. Grace, who ends his career with Gloucestershire. Is it Gloucestershire? Yes, I think so. Now, if you look up photos of Billy Murdoch at this time, there are a number of fantastic photos of him and Grace together. They seem to have formed this wonderful friendship, even though they were on-field adversaries a decade earlier, when they were both at their peak. How do you explain this friendship? How did it come about? Did Grace actively recruit the great former Australian captain? What can you tell us about it?
I think the friendship goes back a long way. I think it was around in 1880 when Grace got 152 and Murdoch, with a couple of last wicket partnerships, got 153. And I think they had a great respect for each other, and they were the two best batsmen in the world.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Long-standing and socially. I mean, it's interesting socially too, because Grace is a doctor. He's not really part of the cricket, establishment. I.e., he's not an aristocrat. He's not a Lord Harris, a Lord Hawke, a Viscount this or whatever. So he's always a slight bit of an outsider. He's obviously tolerated because he's an amazing player and he's the face of the game. And Murdoch is very much like that too. He's a bit of an outsider. He qualified as a solicitor, Grace qualified as a doctor. So they're quite socially on a sort of class level, quite similar. They're both quite funny and entertaining. Later on, Murdoch always had funny quips and sayings. When he was writing the Daily Mail, he often called players funny, like Tibby Cotter, he always used to call him Terror Cotter,
Right.
not the terror, but
Yes.
terror as in a pot. Terror, T-R-R-A, Cotter, C-O-T-A. So he's quite funny and gregarious. And I think, the pair of them loved that sort of life of playing cricket, country house cricket, playing club cricket. If they decided golf got popular, they decided to take up golf. Grace was a terrible golfer, but Murdoch wasn't bad. They decided to take up bowls together, and both were really good at bowls.
Very good, yeah.
So at Crystal Palace, where London County was, there was a bowling club, and they got involved and sort of took that over. So I think they just had a really good time, these two sort of famous middle-aged cricketers.
Murdoch loved to stay up late and drink and socialise. Did Grace do that? Grace, presumably.
Well, of course, Grace notoriously, when he came here with Lord Sheffield, is said to have drank, 3,000 pounds worth of wine.
Yes, so late night sociability.
Yes, I think the story Grace used to, certainly in his later years when he put on a lot of weight, he was drinking whiskey and soda before going out to batting, I think. This is a question without notice, but do you also think they possibly shared a similar view of money and cricket? Grace was the most famous shamateur of them all. He certainly used cricket as a way of making money. Did Billy, we know he had financial issues, but did he also try and extract money from cricket?
I think he always was trying to do that, but he failed. Like, he would have liked to have been secretary of the MCC because he would have got £300 a year, and they weren't having a bar of that. And the period when he's playing for London County, after that he starts to write for the Daily Mail as a cricket correspondent. So they were paying him. He only managed to do that for a season. It sort of peters out. Begins enthusiastically when the 1980s.
Got shorter and shorter.
Yeah, the articles get shorter and shorter. And, initially he's very keen. It's the 1905 Australian side coming, and he's writing for the Daily Mail, and then that sort of peters out. We had the trip to South Africa.
He went there for money.
So
there is a parallel with Grace.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
And just on that, Rick, was he a good writer? You've mentioned he came up with these nicknames of players as such, but is his observations of cricket good? As far as we know, he didn't have a ghostwriter. This is actually Murdoch.
He wrote all this material himself. He was, and I think that the articles that appeared in the Daily Mail are quite interesting, when he comments on. So the Daily Mail got him to Limerick, so he could get on board the ship with the Australians. So he became the first person to talk to the 1905 Australian team. And there's some quite interesting observations about, the Australian players, that Clem Hill, he thinks Clem Hill is going to retire very shortly because he only seems to be interested in stockbroking pages of the newspapers. And then he also tells the Australian players that, the best bowler in England is a bowler from Derbyshire. I think he said it was Arnie Warren. I think it was Warren, which was really pressing because he only ever played one test and he got a trumper out in both innings. And then he got on the piss, and Lords never selected him again.
Yeah.
But, so there were quite interesting observations. He didn't pull any punches. He told Jack Hobbs that, needed to improve his fielding. He said that in the papers. This was a very young Jack Hobbs at that point. So they're quite interesting articles. I wouldn't say they're not, it's not Neville Cardus, but it's entertaining.
And they're certainly useful for the biographer to find how he views the next generation and whether there's that, cricket was better in my day sort of approach. Which
I don't know if there's much reflective sense in his writing.
Right.
We don't get a sense of how Murdoch looks at all this.
And they increasingly became matches closer to home. He obviously got fed up with travelling to, it's funny when you said they peter out. Yeah, they do peter out, and they come shorter, and he obviously prefers to watch a match at the Oval or Lords than having to travel to Cheltenham.
So he finally retires in 1904, which coincides with London County losing its first-class status. It didn't have full first-class status, but it was given first-class status for various games, but they're finally... they lose everything and he decides to retire. Grace, I think, goes on for a few more seasons, playing the odd match here and there. What did retirement, or certainly his non-cricket playing days, look like for Murdoch? How did he occupy his time?
Well, this is a bit tricky. Not a lot of information on that. I mean, in 1905, he wrote for the Daily Mail, and then we know that he ends up back in Australia 9 or 10 because of the court case. What happens between those two? Well, it's a bit difficult to know. The children are now all growing up and at schools or have left school. One of the boys is at Repton, and in 1904 is playing for Repton at the same side as Jack Crawford, the most considered to be the greatest, most prodigious qualified schoolboy. He went on to play for Surrey while still at Repton. So, he's got a son who's doing well at Repton in his last year. What happens between 1906 and that other period? Well, we know that he and Jemima went to Europe. There's the odd snippet here and there where someone said he was in Paris.
Didn't he go to the races?
Went to races, did some pigeon shooting down south of France, but it's all very patchy. It's just the odd. There are no letters that give us any indication of what they're doing at this point, and there's just the odd snippets in newspapers. They were seen this or there, or they were back in Australia, I think in 1909. So I think, they did the Grand Tour of Europe. That seems pretty clear. They could obviously manage to do that. I mean, even though they all seem to be struggling financially, they're still pretty well off. I mean, they've got £1,000 a year for the children's education, and they've got £600 a year, which is still a lot of money in that period. So, they could live really well. But we lose sight of them a bit in this period. Murdoch's a solicitor. But there has not been, unfortunately, a big cache of Murdoch letters, which is a great pity.
He might turn up.
Well, that would be amazing, wouldn't it, if they turned up?
Were you aware of this before you dove headfirst into a Murdoch biography? You've each individually danced around Murdoch's life with your other research. Were you aware of the dearth of letters before you started researching? Because these letters often for a biographer are the basis of a biography.
I think we knew.
Yeah, I think that, and when it's very rare you find caches of letters. I remember Peter Wynne-Thomas wrote the biography of Arthur Shrewsbury. He was well embarked on that, and then a relative just dumped a load of letters on his desk. I mean, wow, what a treasure trove that was. So I think in the period that we've been working in, it is quite rare to find large collections of letters from
any letters.
Yeah, any letters either written to or from people. It's very hard to find them.
Maybe they'll turn up one day. Someone will clear out that. Possibly, yes. The Murdoch letters revealed. Which, it makes you think, why is there very little? Is it because Murdoch didn't care? Was he not a collector? Did he have no sense of posterity? I mean, or was it perhaps the subsequent generations who tossed it all out? I mean, you've got other cricketers like a Trumper where there's a lot of memorabilia and people look far and wide for his bats and caps. But from what you're saying, there's little in existence now of Billy.
I don't think he tossed it out. I don't think he had a good reflective sense of what he was and what enterprise he was involved in.
Yes.
So I don't think he wrote much in letters, or he certainly didn't write articles. And
it's a good point. I mean, we have to remember in the 1880s, 90s, there's not that sense that there is now of keeping bats and caps. I mean, there probably wasn't the market that there is now for these items for collectors and such. So they often, I mean, we know stories of Trumper and things, giving his bats away after one knock and using some schoolboy's bat and then giving it back to him, sort of thing. It was a different time, that's for sure.
And look at Trumper. Oh, Victor Trumper's diary of the 1902 or 1899 tour. And then look at the diary. It says batted with duff.
Yeah.
That's
Right.
an entry for a whole page. So
Yeah.
Ended with duff for a whole page.
yeah, it was like, okay, that was a bit of a disappointment.
Yeah.
There was a beginning sense of the value of memorabilia because in the 1882 test, Blackham got the ball,
Yes.
and subsequently that's appeared, and it's been.
And I think Blackham then put it up for auction in his lifetime. I think I've read this somewhere to raise funds for.
Was mounted on something.
Yeah. And it was to raise funds for something like a new stand at the MCG or something, and it made a huge amount of money. So, you're right on that front, Richard. Also, going back to the previous discussion about what Murdoch was doing post-cricket, during this time, the J.B. Watson estate. So just to explain, when he died, it was stipulated after 20 years. So in 1909, up until then, the trust would allow, say, Billy and Jemima to have, was it £600 to live off? And then 20 years after the death, it was finally, the lands were sold or valuated. Buildings, yeah.
In Melbourne, he owned large parts of central Melbourne. Yeah,
were finally sold and then disseminated amongst the remaining children, Jemima being one. So finally, the Murdoch family comes into all this money, I assume.
Just a few years before he died.
Just before, yes.
Just before
maybe the shock killed him. So is this finally the resolution that he's looking for in terms of financial stability?
Well, if it was, he didn't live long to enjoy it because, he died. Jemima went back to England in 1917 or 18. She ends up in an asylum. She dies, not long after that. One of her daughters dies around the same time. A couple of the boys, one joins the the RAF. Another one dies in the late 20s, having gambled most of the family money away. So the family sort of disintegrates really after that. So
he took his life, didn't he?
Yeah, he gassed himself, unfortunately, in south of France. So after all this attempt to get part of this enormous wealth, what happens? The family just doesn't. Murdoch dies. Jemima goes into an asylum. Children have various tragic endings.
So returning to his death, which is how you started the book, 1911 at the MCG. It's the Test match Australia and South Africa, I think. He dies during the lunch break. What was Murdoch's reputation in Australia at that time? Was he revered? Would he been welcomed into the long room as the Australian champion that we now consider him to be?
I think he was recognised, and I don't know whether he was revered because he left Australia.
And there's a funny article that in the Melbourne Leader, I think that Felix
Tom
Horan wrote about, I was walking down Melbourne, I bumped into Billy Murdoch. But the fact that, Murdoch clearly hadn't come back and with a great, it wasn't being feted and celebrated. I bumped into him by chance and then he'd gone.
Yeah.
But it was definitely Billy Murdoch. I recognize, he says, I sort of recognise Murdoch. It was definitely Murdoch. But the fact he was in the pavilion, I suppose, at Melbourne, some acceptance of him.
But he didn't come back for the cricket. He came back for the will of J.B. Watson. So it probably would have been a quite low key return.
There is a wonderful photo. I think you and I have discussed it online, Rick. I think taken at this maybe in 1909 he was back for something and he's sitting, I think, outside the MCC, and there's a team photo of former players. George Giffen's there and Harry Trott, I think, is there, and he's sitting front row centre like Grace Wood. He's got a straw hat on, and it's probably one of the last photos of him taken, actually. It's lovely, and it's readily available online. gentlemen, the next section of the podcast is going through his statistics. I'm just going to read them out. Afterwards, we can discuss them. There's not much to talk about on the bowling front. I mentioned earlier, I think he took 10 first-class wickets. But overall, so I'll go through his test record. He played 19 matches, 34 innings. He was left not out on 5 occasions. He scored a total of 908 runs with a high score of 211. So his overall test average was 31.31. He scored 2 centuries in his test career and 150, and he took 14 catches. As is often the case with cricketers from this time, his first-class record is much more substantial. So he played 391 matches, 679 innings, scored a total of 16,953 runs with a high score of 321, famous innings. His first-class average was 26.86, and he scored 19 centuries. Interestingly, he scored 85 50s. So again, this is the era before mega huge scores. He'd often reach 50 and then get out.
But it's also the era of uncovered wickets.
Exactly.
So, it's much harder.
Yes.
Than to go on from 50 to 100 or even bigger scores, because the wickets were much more difficult.
And from what I've read, particularly in the 1870s and 80s, the wickets were really bad. This was before they had curators, and so wickets would and this is the case in England and Australia, but you would imagine in Australia with the heat that the wickets were unruly. Batsmen were often hit terribly hard, and so it is still a very impressive record. And I did just a little analysis of his career after 1890, so he returns, and his batting average only dips slightly. So it goes from first class record overall is 26.86, and then after 1890 it's 23.3. So as I mentioned earlier, he's now living in England playing first class cricket, and there's a lot more matches. Finally gets his eye in, and he can still.
Just a comment on what I found is that he only played 19 tests in 13 years. And his average 31, I think, was pretty good.
It's up there. I mean, the sort of, for modern listeners, you expect a good or great batsman these days to be above 50, I suppose. That's the benchmark. But we have to think of this in the 19th century standards. And it is quite comparable. I know Trumper and Clem Hill, who are the next generation, theirs are in the high 30s. Yeah. So it sneaks up at this point. But as we've been saying, this is a different time with
the wickets get better.
Wickets. Exactly.
From the 1880s.
Exactly. So in summary, as we reach the end of this podcast, let's talk about his legacy. What was astounding to me is that at the time of you writing this book, and published in 2019, Murdoch wasn't in the Australian Cricket Hall of Fame. He is now. That's been corrected. But why do you think, for such a giant of the game, it took so long for him to be placed in the Hall of Fame?
Prejudice against an Anglo-Australian, and the fact that he more or less turned his back on Australian cricket from the point of view of some Australians.
Yeah, I think it was interesting that one of the reasons he got in the Hall of Fame actually was the book we wrote. That really was part and parcel of the sort of lobby. I mean, we didn't write this book to get him in the Hall of Fame, but the fact that this book became available and people then began to understand what a significant person he was, the small committee that makes these decisions, which I think is in Melbourne, does have the benefit of Gideon Hay on it. I assume he's still on it, and Gideon obviously has great love and understanding for this whole period, and that certainly helped get him into the Australian Hall of Fame. Richard also said earlier, out of mind and forgotten. Plus, the sort of view, it's always been difficult to this Australian Hall of Fame. People's perceptions. Oh, there was cricket before Bradman. Oh,
yes, there's cricket before Trumper.
Yeah, these people are. It's hard to get recognition for them. I
have to say, I think cricket more than other sports, actually does recognise some of the early pioneers quite well. I know from...
It started to.
It certainly has. I know from other... I have a particular love of Australian rules football, and the early pioneers of the game are still completely forgotten in terms of Hall of Fame and official recognition. Cricket from the start, I think when the Hall of Fame started in 1996, Spofforth was there and Trumper, of course. And they have over time recognised some of these 19th century greats, but I was still astounded that Murdoch wasn't one of the first inducted. He should have been alongside Spofforth, really, as the captain of the side that started the Ashes. But also his first class record is excellent.
But look at the Sydney Cricket Ground. This is the ground where Murdoch's home ground, where he made some of his great innings. Is there any recognition at the SCG of Billy Murdoch? Well, there's only the plaque in the dining room, along with the other great players. But that's it. And any attempt, why doesn't the SCG have Murdoch Gates like Lord's has Grace Gates? A player, there's no statue of Billy Murdoch. So it's just...
Well, if this book instigated him being inducted into the Hall of Fame, maybe this podcast can start a campaign for maybe a stand, or is that too much? But maybe a statue at the SCG.
There was even a struggle with the Trumper stand. There was a debate about whether the Trumper stand should be named after Trumper. Any recognition would be great, even if it was something, good. At least a player of his stature would be recognised at the SCG.
Is there anything in England for his time in England? Sussex have...
No, not that I'm aware.
We got the Inner West Council had some recognition.
Oh, that's true. Yes.
Gladstone Park.
Okay.
There's a, what do you call it?
Yes, there's a display there in Gladstone Park, because Gladstone Park in Balmain was where it's said Spofforth and Murdoch used to play, and also used to be called Pigeon Park. They used to shoot pigeons there. Murdoch grew up for a time in Balmain, and Spofforth grew up in Glebe. Yes. They did go to school together.
Spofforth was,
and they played either with or against each other. So they were very strongly identified with the Balmain area. So the Inner West Council have put up a display in the park, which is really nice. They've done that.
So final statements on Murdoch. How should we remember him today?
The man who helped establish him and Spofforth the Ashes tradition, very instrumental in starting that great tradition in cricket, but also Australia's first world-class batsman, a scorer of big hundreds, and someone who helped put Australian cricket on the international map and helped with that victory in 1882 establish the viability of international test cricket.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree 100%. Richard said nothing to add. That's exactly spot on.
Lovely. One final question, and this is a question I ask all my guests. What would Billy Murdoch think of modern cricket, whether that be the white ball, T20, women playing cricket? Was he someone who adapted to the changes in cricket, or was he a traditionalist?
I mean, it's always really hard, across generations and epochs and eras. That's why I think it's always very difficult when people say, oh, so-and-so is a better batsman than so-and-so. But I think Billy was quite conservative as a person. So I find it hard to believe he'd enjoy, BBL or IPL.
Women's cricket.
Women's cricket, yeah, probably not. You don't get the impression he was particularly progressive. But women's cricket.
But he was a great lover of cricket.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
I think he might have. He might even have enjoyed some of the new forms of cricket, although he probably would lament decline of traditional cricket.
The money that splashed around today would have solved some of his financial issues. He would have put his hand up straight away to go to the IPL, I would have imagined.
Yes.
Gentlemen, thank you both.
But one final thing.
Oh, yes?
The book is still available.
Well,
Yes.
I am going to mention this in my...
good.
but no, please.
The book is available in paperback, and we also have some limited edition signed copies, and they're signed by one of Billy's descendants. Two authors.
Two of the descendants, the two great grandchildren.
Jane Joyce.
Yeah, and they got a great grandson in London. Remember, he signed them, and you and I. So yes, the book is available. How did they get it, Richard? Go to the website.
Walla Walla Press.
Walla Walla Press.
Well, I would encourage everyone to do that, having read it myself. It's an excellent read, but it's also excellently researched. So credit...
Got the footnotes, got the
footnotes,
bibliographies.
yes.
Got some great pictures in it.
And credit to you both, having just learned what you said earlier, that it did, you think, campaign silently for his induction into the Hall of Fame. So Billy Murdoch Cricketing Colossus from 2019 is still available. Please do go out and get it. It's well worth a read. So thank you, gentlemen, both.
Thank you, Tom. It's great to talk to you. And if we were going to write the book again, it'd be great to have this conversation. We would have had lots more ideas to insert into the book.
Absolutely. Well, you've both written on other subjects from this period, so you're welcome back at any time. My name is Tom Ford. Thanks for listening. Until next time, it's bye for now.